Welcome back to PLS 510. Today we are going to start the units on pasture management. And overall, there will be three on pasture management. The PowerPoint file may not be loaded in three parts. The first two parts may be loaded together, but you will see that reflected in Canvas. So let's get started with pasture management. And I realize as we're going through this and as I've delivered the lecture in class that a lot of the principles that we have tried to talk about pasture growth, forage growth, species, livestock, are all going to be integrated into this lecture, these three lectures. And so in order to approach this topic, I wanted to do it in a series of questions for you. And these are relevant questions. They're questions that are may seem rather straightforward, but once you think about it, they do, in fact, change based on the scenarios that you find yourself in, whether in this case you're looking at a cow-calf operation in the upper left. On the upper right, that's a very productive grass-fed beef operation in western Kentucky. The picture of the goat is actually on a farm in Clay County, Kentucky, that sells freezer meat. And the foals are on a commercial thoroughbred farm here in the central Kentucky. And all of these have got different pasture goals. But let's get started with you wrestling with your very own pasture goals. So what I'd like you to do right now is to visualize a system, any system. And you got to visualize both the farm limitations or the farm goals, the why is the farm there, what kind of livestock is it, and so on. So please pause your lecture now and write down 3 or 4 or as many as you can think of goals that would be appropriate for that system. Okay, pause the lecture. These are some of the ones that we came up with when we did the live class. We wanted environmentally sound pastures. We wanted a system that had good yield and good carrying capacity. And as we'll learn, that means the same a carrying capacity as the full season stocking rate is capable for on that farm, on all the pasture acres. Minimal hay feeding was brought up. We wanted a thick stand for hoof support for horses. We want low weeds. We want it to be logistically efficient, and that means can we do it with one person? Is it easy? Is moving cattle easy enough that it's not just the difficulty? Is that a barrier to adoption? Low input, minimizing the use of herbicides and chemical fertilizers can be important to some. And then there are some that just love the aesthetic value of pastures and prefer pastures as the land use as opposed to crops. One we did not put on here, which would be a pasture goal of minimizing fescue toxicosis. And that's going to lead to the next points that we might make. At this point, I want to list some pasture management goals that are going to drive these next 3 lectures, and I'll try to use them in an outline that you can follow fairly clearly as you go through this, but some pretty safe and pretty major pasture goals for any pasture, any situation you find yourself in. Number 1, having the longest possible grazing season, and understood in that is at a reasonable cost. Number 2, having enough forage so that the intake and the forage quality is not limiting. Number 3, you want to have appropriate amounts of utilization, and we'll find out that you can overutilize pastures, and that winds up making that not very productive as a farm. We want to manage for maximum regrowth from the pasture plants, and we want to manage so that the pasture plants that we have will persist. But let's get back to the scenario where you're going to be thinking about this hypothetical farm goals and moving forward. So I want to pose this question to you. How does pasture management change with some of the different goals that we listed on a couple slides back. So I'll stop right here for just a moment. You pause the lecture and think about how pasture management would change with different goals. And flip back if you need to at the goals that we listed to prompt yourself for ideas for this particular slide. So pause the lecture. Here are some of the ones that we came up with in class and that I've come up with. Pasture management goals. It might change depending on the goal. That's going to affect your choice of species. For example, such as using clover that can be established by overseeding, because you may not have the equipment needed to renovate by a no-till drill, or the terrain may not be conducive for that, or you may need the clover because you're trying to deal with tall fescue. You may have a water system development issue and you need more water system to get better utilization, a better water system. You may need to add a different forage species to have better seasonal forage distribution so that you don't have to feed as much hay. You may have to change your fencing design or add fencing to minimize the labor needed. You may need to use hay feeding systems that distribute nutrients and minimize the use of chemical fertilizers. And you may need to focus mainly on just having a pure grass stand of the thickest possible cool season grass, or Bermuda grass for that matter, for hoof support for horses. So it's not trivial to go through the exercise of determining your pasture goals and then letting the management follow from that. So that you're at the point now where you have pasture goals, you know what your management implications are how they're going to change based on what you have chosen as your goals. But a very crucial step right now is to think about what your pasture system resources are. So please stop the lecture and again, visualize your hypothetical situation or a real one that you know of. And think about what are those pasture system resources. Okay, pause the lecture. Here are some resources that I could think of. First of all, having natural water sources, streams and ponds would be a great resource. The soil resource itself, its natural fertility and how deep it is, how productive it is a great resource, and it's something you need to know about. And it's why we went through the exercise of using the Web Soil Survey for this class. Boy, having a good perimeter fence is also a great pasture resource. The ability to distribute water across the system, as we will see later on in this lecture, is very important. And somebody mentioned having smart friends would be important, and I think that's right. Or friends with tractors, or friends with pickup trucks. Certainly, you're not in this alone. And the farming community is most of the time very willing to offer advice and to give help. And I would say one of your biggest resources would be an unbiased information source, and that's certainly the UK Cooperative Extension Service here in Kentucky or across the country. Shade or access to it is a very important pasture resource, as well as terrain that allows making stored feed. Even though making stored feed is not a pasture issue per se, but your pasture system will oftentimes not be adequate to graze 365 days. So you need to be able to make some hay. And the last question for you is, what is your forage supply? So what is this farm that you have in your mind? What does it have available for you to graze? So I'll pause the lecture and let you write that down. Okay, so you've got your choices there. I'm going to list a few that are some of the common ones that we might use in a forage system. Using fescue or other cool season-based grasses, maybe having an improved grass such as orchard grass, alfalfa or alfalfa grass. I don't put it there, I don't note it there, but you could have alfalfa or a mixed stand of alfalfa and grass for high quality hay and pasture. Summer annuals or perennials, Good clover stands in strategic fields, stockpile tall fescue to help you with forage in the fall, and winter annuals in some cases, like small grains or ryegrasses or others, to help in the very early spring and sometimes in the fall as well. So these are options that are very commonly found and used here in Kentucky. Now, I want to remind you that the NRCS Graze tool that we've shared via email will help you do what-if scenarios with various forages. And I think coming up next is an example of a run from that program. Nope, no, there's one other thing before that. First of all, if we've got a cool season base, even an alfalfa grass base, which is more productive in summer than some cool season species, you're going to end up with something like this. You're going to get peaks of growth in the spring, a lesser peak in the fall, and deficits in the midsummer and in the wintertime below what the growing animal livestock forage requirement is. So, how are you going to manage this? Obviously, that's why we make hay when we have a surplus. We can add forages over time that will provide seasonally needed yield, particularly that midsummer and sometimes in the fall and winter. And you can alter livestock numbers. Sell some to reduce the total herd size or move them to other fields. In other words, add acres. That's a way of changing your stocking rate. You can also do some things like, say, buying in stockers in the spring to graze off this peak of forage growth here in the spring. One of the things you'll find when you do that is that sometimes you're working against the market prices, because when we have grass becoming very abundant like this, the demand for young calves with a lot of growth potential is very high, and so the prices tend to be high. So if you are a spring stocker operation, and that's what that's called, when you're buying young animals to graze, young cattle, one of the things you have to be very aware of is, what is the market doing? What is the price doing? Because typically, as the season moves along, the price will slide. It'll go back. It'll decline on a per pound basis, and so a lot of times the lowest point in the year is going to come here in midsummer to late summer, because that's when a lot of calves are being weaned and sold. So be aware of the market forces that are going to impact your profitability. So this is a forage scenario or output from the NRCS Graze tool, and you can see in this one that we've got quite a lot of production. We obviously have some summer production here. We've used some stockpile tall fescue here, and we wind up with way extra forage up here in the spring, and you can tell this is the need, the orange line. This bump here is the fact that we were buying stockers in this scenario and putting them on the pasture between September and October, and then they're going to need to be fed, and then they're going to be sold in February or grazed through the end of January, sold February. So you can see that the need here, we're not overstocked. We've got plenty of surplus growth that we can harvest for hay to get us through this period from December, January, February, and March. So I'd remind you as we close out this lecture to please run at least one scenario using the NRCS's Graze spreadsheet. You should have this in an email from me, and if you don't, email me or call me or text me. Create a hypothetical scenario with livestock and some forages and look at each of the tabs generated by the model. And I would like you to please print off all those pages and send those to me as a PDF. And if you can merge them into one PDF file, that's all fine. If not, just send them to me individually. And I know that's going to be 8 or 9 pages, but go ahead and do that. For the soil suitability choice, or the blank, use a value of 1. So that brings me to the close of this part 1 of pasture management, reminding you that the goals that we're going to be trying to follow in general for any pasture, and especially as we build these 3 lectures on pasture management is going to be, the goals are going to be a long grazing season, adequate forage for good intake and quality, utilization that balances the need for the animals to have enough to eat, but also for forages to regrow. And we want to manage for maximum regrowth because that means we've achieved the yield that we need. And we want also that our grazing management is such that we allow those productive species, those taller growing erect species, to persist. So this is going to bring me to the close of this first lecture on pasture management. Until next time, I'll see you then.